Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insights. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support our museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get an exclusive discount and your very own events programme. Today I'm delighted to welcome John Gilbert McCurdy. John is Professor of History at Eastern Michigan University, where he teaches courses on colonial and revolutionary America, as well as LGBTQIA+ history. He's the author of 3 books and has held fellowships from the British Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the University of Michigan. Today, John will be talking about the story of Robert Newburgh, a British Army chaplain whose trial reveals the links between sexuality and revolution in the late 18th century. Just some tech points. There will be a chance for questions at the end, both in person and our online audience. For our online audience, if you want to put your questions in the Q&A chat bar, we will pass them on to John. If you encounter any problems with the stream, please refresh it. That usually fixes everything. Otherwise, we will have a member of staff in the chat bar ready to answer any questions you may have. With that all said, I will now pass over to John and hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. I want to thank the National Army Museum for the invitation to speak to here this afternoon. And I want to highlight the work of Danny Wilson and Amy Sheehan for arranging my visit. I also want to recognize my good friend, Dr. Sandra Slater from the College of Charleston, who's also joining me here today. So how did people think about homosexuality in revolutionary America? What did they think about it? These seemingly simple questions are actually quite difficult to answer. For the last 60 years, historians have detailed the complex story of the founding of the United States. We know about issues of race, gender, religion, and even class and how they interacted with the American Revolution. But we don't know much about the role that LGBTQ people played in the creation of the United States. Part of the notion is an evolving notion of part of the problem rather, is an evolving notion of sexual identity. While people of the same sex have always been intimate, the understanding of such intimacies has changed considerably over time. We've gone from seeing it as a sin against God to one against the state to not being a crime at all. Moreover, the term homosexual was not coined until the 1860s, nearly a century after the American Revolutionary War. Conversely, terms like sodomy and buggery did exist in the 18th century, but these often referred to acts rather than individuals. Another problem that we have is limited sources. Unlike later eras, there are only scraps of evidence to understand same-sex intimacy in the 18th century. Now, for the American Revolution, probably the best-known example is that of Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer who joined the War for Independence on the side of the Americans and taught the Continental soldiers how to march. One of the reasons why von Steuben left Europe and came to America, in addition to his appreciation for liberty, was because he had taken familiarity with young boys back in Prussia and had to leave the country. Now, these examples are frustratingly curt. They tell us little about how people in revolutionary America thought about homosexuality and nothing about how these people thought about themselves. Moreover, they offer little insight into how the War for Independence affected or was affected by their sexuality. In contrast, the more we have studied African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups in the Revolution, the more we've come to appreciate how independence radicalized these groups and laid the foundations for a more inclusive notion of citizenship in the nation that followed. Calls for freedom from the enslaved gave rise to abolitionism, while the insistence that the founders remember the ladies led to the campaign for women's suffrage. Might the revolution also have had a radical effect on men who had sex with men? And if so, is there a legacy to this inclusion? About 15 years ago, I found a story that I believe allows me to try to answer some of these questions. In the summer of 2011, I was researching at the American Revolution at the William L. Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is conveniently very close to where I live. The Clements Library is one of the great repositories of early North American history and an exceptional collection of papers relating to the British Army on the eve of the American Revolution. In particular, the Clements contains the papers of General Thomas Gage, who served as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America from 1763 to 1775. Gage was an exceptional bureaucrat. He kept copies of all of his papers and kept these preserved, himself held onto them. Later, his family sold them to the Clements Library, which continues to preserve them to this day. Among the manuscripts in the Gage papers, I discovered a 26-page trial transcript of the case of Robert Newburgh, a British Army officer who was accused of buggery. I skimmed the transcript at the time, but as it was filled with names and incidents that I couldn't make much sense of, I set it aside. It wasn't until after I'd finished writing another book that I came back to the Clements Library and the curious transcript to see if I could make something of this source. Well, I discovered that the transcript in Ann Arbor was one of but several legal actions involving Robert Newburgh. And I discovered 6 more cases in the UK National Archives at Kew. Nearly every other source from this era is very vague, but these transcripts and their supporting documents are dripping with detail. We actually get to hear what people thought about men who had sex with men, and we have an opportunity to think about how a man accused of same-sex intimacy negotiated this world. Moreover, the trials took place in Philadelphia and New York City less than a year before the revolution began, and several of the men involved in the trials fought for the war for independence. More importantly, the rhetoric and ideology of the revolution seeps through the testimony. The enemies of Robert Newburgh feared that his buggery threatened to bring down the British Empire, while he and his defenders utilized a language of rights and equality that was much closer to the words of the American founders than that of the British Army. Vicious and immoral, homosexuality, the American Revolution, and the trials of Robert Newburgh is the result of this investigation. And in my talk today, I want to give an overview of the book and discuss what the trials can tell us about homosexuality in the American Revolutionary era. I believe that these cases can help us to understand how people thought about homosexuality in revolutionary America and what they thought about it. Before I start, I want to warn you that the trials of Robert Newburgh are an imperfect data set. They cover only a small number of people over a short period of time. These documents only discuss male-male intimacy. There is little concern for lesbianism, bisexuality, or transgender issues. Although women and African Americans appear occasionally, every voice recorded is white and male. I also don't have images of the principal people involved. I don't have an image of Robert Newburgh or almost any of the people also involved in this case. And I want to acknowledge this before I start showing you images and having people get confused. Instead, I've drawn pictures from here at the National Army Museum and also from the Library of Congress in the United States to give illustrations of the era. Despite these limitations, I believe that Newburgh's trials clearly indicate that homosexuality was widely understood in the era of the Revolution in ways not dissimilar to our own, and that through his arguments, Robert Newburgh laid out better than anyone else the case for sexual liberalism in the nation that followed. To understand the trials of Robert Newburgh, we have to begin with the man himself. Robert Newburgh was born in 1742 near Dublin, Ireland. His parents were Protestants, and they descended from English planters that had remade the island into an English colony. Robert grew up with the privileges of an elite background. He was skilled at horse riding, he spoke Latin, and he studied with a private tutor. At 16, he entered Trinity College and took his bachelor's degree 4 years later. After completing his education, Robert Newburgh became a priest. He had been raised in the Anglican tradition and took holy orders in the Church of Ireland, a Protestant denomination that was the Irish branch of the Church of England. Upon ordination, Newburgh became a traveling parson, serving in several curacies or temporary appointments across the island. 3 years later, he entered the British Army as a chaplain. He purchased a commission in the 18th Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal Irish Regiment. In May of 1773, Robert Newburgh made his way to Cork, on the southern coast of Ireland, to seek passage to America. The 18th Regiment was then stationed in Philadelphia, and the regiment's colonel was insistent that Newburgh join his unit as soon as possible. However, before he could depart, Robert Newburgh received a most disquieting letter. "I am unfortunately acquainted with some parts of your character," the letter began, "which render you a very improper person to act as chaplain to a regiment I highly honor." According to the letter, several former and current British Army officers had testified that Newburgh was guilty of a most horrid and unnatural crime, particularly with your own manservant, whom you slept with. The man who wrote the letter was Thomas Batt, who had been formerly a captain in the 18th Regiment. Bat had recently retired from military service and was in Ireland procuring wares for a wine shop that he would later open in Philadelphia. While in Ireland, Bat heard rumors about Newburgh's sexual relations with his servant, and in Bat's opinion, Newburgh's actions disqualified him from service in the army. So what was Robert Newburgh accused of doing? According to one testimony, when Newburgh was a traveling priest, he rented a room in the Irish town of Sligo. He brought a valet with him, and a separate bed was placed in the chambers for his servant boy. However, the landlady did notice and remark that the said pallet bed was unspoiled, meaning that the servant's bed was not used or slept on. In other words, the two men had slept together. Now, to be sure, it was not unusual for two men to share a bed in the 18th century. But those who saw Newburgh and his servant interact reported that the boy was very free with the priest, much more so than was typical of master-servant relations. One observer noted that the two men quarreled like an old married couple, and that Newburgh always kept his servant remarkably neat. The story of Newburgh and his servant spread across Ireland and remained a topic of gossip 4 years later. In fact, Thomas Bat, who began the accusation of Newburgh, did not seek out the information. Rather, it came to him over casual conversation. A short time before he left the regiment, Bat was in a company of a number of gentlemen who asked if he knew the new chaplain to the 18th Regiment. When Bat replied that he did not, they laughed at me a good deal and said I should soon know him, for that the first opportunity he would be into my beef. In short, many told me he was a notorious buggerer. Now, this story troubled Thomas Bat, so he investigated the rumors, and soon he corroborated them. Bat met a ship's captain in Cork who was about to sail for America. Robert Newburgh had sought passage on this same ship, but the captain had refused to carry him to Philadelphia. As the captain told Bat, if he took Mr. Newburgh to sea with him, that Mr. Newburgh would cruise up his gut. The language used to describe Newburgh's sexual activities is revealing. Gut was a euphemism for rectum, while beef referred to the stocky part of a man's body, such as his backside. Historians have argued that in the 18th century, sodomy was a confused category and applied to a whole host of actions. But when Thomas Bat spoke of this, he spoke of a specific sexual act in his account of Robert Newburgh's sexual activities. Perhaps most revealing, Bat thought Newburgh's actions were not confined to one man. Rather, he lusted to penetrate any man, even him. For it was not what Newburgh had done that concerned Thomas Bat, it was what he might desire to do in the future. When Bat named Newburgh a notorious buggerer, he was describing not acts, but a rudimentary sexual identity. Now, Robert Newburgh was mortified by Thomas Bat's claims. In subsequent testimony, he admitted that he had indeed slept with his servant when they were in Sligo. But this was innocent, Newburgh insisted. He had grown up with the servant, and the two had frequently slept together because Newburgh was often ill. But such an explanation did little to calm Thomas Bat's fears. In the 18th century, homoerotic desire was often believed to be the result of a nervous condition, such that Newburgh's admission of illness only confirmed his penchant for buggery. In June of 1773, Robert Newburgh departed for America. His chronic illness impeded his travels such that he did not reach Philadelphia until September of that year. Thomas Bat preceded him to Philadelphia by a month, meaning that by the time Robert Newburgh joined his regiment, everyone had heard the rumor about his sexual activities. In the fall of 1773, Robert Newburgh began his duties as chaplain to the 18th Regiment. He delivered Sunday sermons, celebrated the Eucharist, and read funeral services for soldiers who had died. Despite the rumors, most of the Royal Irish treated him with respect. He even became close friends with two officers, Lieutenant Alexander Fowler and Ensign Nicholas Trist. Trist later testified that they have had a club amongst themselves on every Monday night at which they talked about religion, science, and history. But not everyone was pleased to have a reputed buggerer in his midst. Probably no member of the 18th Regiment proved a greater nemesis than Captain Benjamin Chapman. Chapman was also an Irish Protestant, but he was a career officer. He harbored ambitions for promotion and took a hard line against anyone who threatened the reputation of the British Army. Once Chapman heard the story that Newburgh had had sex with his servant, he carefully observed the priest until he found proof that Robert Newburgh was a buggerer. In November of 1773, Captain Benjamin Chapman was walking with the secretary to the governor of New York. As Chapman and the other man talked, the Reverend Mr. Newburgh galloped close by them in a most unbecoming dress. Newburgh, according to Chapman, was on horseback, and his appearance so startled the colonial official that he asked if he knew whose groom that was. When Chapman explained that it was the regiment's religious leader, the official replied that he was also sorry to see it, for he looked more like a fashionable groom or jockey than one of that sacred function. The incident so embarrassed Chapman that he vowed never to take any notice of Newburgh unless unavoidably compelled to it. As a priest, Robert Newburgh was expected to wear drab clothes, and many Anglican clergymen wore black cassocks. But on horseback, Robert Newburgh wore a long coat with a red collar, according to Benjamin Chapman. Nor was his inappropriate attire confined to horse riding. In Philadelphia, Robert Newburgh wore a light-colored coat, leather knickers, and white silk stockings. When he ventured to the theater, he wore an elaborate hat. While such clothes were popular among the elites of the 1770s, in Chapman's opinion, they made Robert Newburgh look like what is now termed a macaroni. Now, this term macaroni only appears once in all the trials involving Robert Newburgh, but it is the most revealing. Macaroni, as we might know, originated as a type of food, but by the 1770s had become a term of derision for men deemed inappropriately masculine. A macaroni could be identified by his clothes and his deportment, which were ridiculously ostentatious. The archetypal macaroni wore spotted or striped clothes, ridiculous wigs, and carried a snuff box. A macaroni's effeminacy was a window into his character, which most agreed was despicable. An English author writing in 1773 deplored fribbling hairdressers, boring orators, and London gadabouts as monkaronis, claiming that luxury had deprived them of their masculinity. Although few connected the macaroni's appearance to sexual desire, some speculated that his effeminacy was predictive of buggery. One caricaturist labeled a macaroni Ganymede, a reference to Jupiter's mythical boy lover, and showed him facing the hangman for his crimes. This was how Captain Benjamin Chapman saw Robert Newburgh, that his flamboyant attire in the macaroni style was proof that he desired to have sex with men. Now, Chapman was not the only officer to take note of Newburgh's appearance or to worry that his desires might harm the regiment. When Robert Newburgh purchased a green coat, a captain remarked that the parson is a buggerer, and everyone around him laughed. Other officers began to worry about Newburgh's intentions among the soldiers. A captain ordered his men to stay away from Newburgh when the quartermaster fretted over Newburgh requested a room near the necessary, because a necessary was a site notorious for male-male sexual trysts. It appears that Robert Newburgh did not seek out sexual partners once he made it to America, either male or female. And certainly the servant he had slept with in Sligo did not accompany him into the army. Yet this did not soften the opinions of his enemies. It was not what Robert Newburgh had done, but who he was. In his initial accusation, Thomas Batt took note of Newburgh's character, and this term resurfaced constantly in assessments of him. Character was synonymous with reputation, but it also had an inner quality that could not be disguised. As Captain Chapman and others observed Robert Newburgh's appearance and actions, they sought to determine whether his very soul was corrupt. Sexual activity was but a manifestation of a man's corrupt character, such that Chapman and Batt could not forgive actions that occurred before Newburgh joined the army. It was not what he had done that disturbed them, but who he was. Historians have argued that in the 18th century, a man's sexual acts were not predictive of his identity. In colonial America, for example, a man accused of sodomizing another man was often whipped or fined, but most of the time it was not assumed that his character was such that he would do it again. The case of Robert Newburgh suggests that this may not have been the case any longer in 1773. It was not just that Robert Newburgh had committed buggery that aroused concern, it was the fear that his character was corrupt. In other words, that he was a buggerer. The term buggerer derives from the term bogomil, which was the name of a 10th century religious sect that was deemed heretical and suspected of sexual depravity, specifically sodomy and bestiality. By the 18th century, however, buggerer was more than a description of a man who had committed buggery. A buggerer had a specific character, and this truth could be observed in his clothes and actions. Buggerers were dangerous. They were immoral and threatened the divine order. They failed to marry and father children, preying on inferior men instead. They tempted others into depravity, not necessarily for sex, but as pawns they could manipulate to ruin society. To be sure, a buggerer was not the same thing as a homosexual, but there were strong parallels between the two. Robert Newburgh had to respond to the charges against him. Yes, I'm on the right slide. Once Captain Chapman shunned him, no enlisted man would go to him for spiritual guidance. Newburgh was a devout Christian who believed it was his duty to help the less fortunate, but without the respect of the soldiers, he could not do his job. As Newburgh began to complain about the situation, his commanding officer, Major Isaac Hamilton, offered him leave to go home. Because the rumours were confined to Ireland, Hamilton reasoned, Newburgh should return home and clear up his reputation there. But Newburgh rejected this offer. If he left, he would effectively forfeit his commission and be bereft of a livelihood. So he stayed and fought for his reputation. Newburgh insisted that he was not a buggerer. Many accused buggerers slunk away. The 18th century was an era of scandal, and the British press was filled with stories of men of the highest rank in the army and the church, driven into exile by their base desires. But Robert Newburgh did not slink away. He had to silence the rumors that he was a buggerer in order to regain his position, but this was an uphill battle. Nearly everyone thought he was a buggerer, and at some point he conceded this fact and acted accordingly. Newburgh began by filing civil suits against his accusers. He sued Thomas Batt in the Court of Common Pleas for Philadelphia County, then filed a case against the captain who had said the parson is a buggerer. He also demanded that the quartermaster be court-martialed for insinuating that his choice of rooms was motivated by prurient desire. But none of these cases altered the consensus that he was a buggerer. If anything, they confirmed that he was a troublemaker who did not belong in the British Army. Accordingly, in the summer of 1774, Robert Newburgh demanded a court-martial to clear his name once and for all. Major Hamilton, his commanding officer, was reluctant to act. So in June, Newburgh convinced a soldier to formally accuse him of buggery. In charges filed with the deputy judge advocate, Private Robert Jeff claimed that because Newburgh was known to have committed buggery, I think it improper in me as a private soldier to pay him any compliment or to call upon him to discharge his duty. With a formal accusation of a sexual crime, the Army had to act. It had to organize a general court-martial to decide on Robert Newburgh's character. Now, all of this took place during a time of crisis in the British Empire. In the summer of 1774, colonists in cities like Philadelphia and New York organized mass protests in response to Parliament's recent closure of the port of Boston. Indeed, as Newburgh's trial began, delegates to the First Continental Congress made their way to Philadelphia. John Adams, a delegate from Massachusetts and future U.S. president, even recorded in his diary passing the very site where Robert Newburgh's trial was taking place. Perhaps Adams or the other soon-to-be revolutionaries might have seen a parallel between Robert Newburgh's case and their own campaign against King George III. In August 1774, 24 members of the 18th Regiment left Philadelphia and traveled to New York City to see their chaplain court-martialed. Robert Newburgh stood accused of vicious and immoral behavior, which broke down into charges of perjury, scandalous and indecent acts, and conduct derogatory from the sacred character with which he is invested. Serving as prosecutor for the Army was Captain Benjamin Chapman, whose sour opinion of Newburgh had not improved over the last 8 months. Officers from other regiments served as a jury, and Robert Newburgh acted as his own defense attorney. The charges were serious. If Robert Newburgh was convicted, he would be cashiered, expelled from the British Army with no recompense for his commission. As he began his case, Captain Chapman announced that the Army would not be prosecuting Newburgh for sodomy. Robert Jeff, the soldier who accused Mr. Newburgh of sodomy, had since deserted, Chapman told the court. Although Chapman dispensed with acts of buggery, he nevertheless proceeded to prosecute Robert Newburgh as a buggerer. It had never been about acts for Chapman. Rather, it was the priest's character that made him unfit for the Army. Chapman thus proceeded to introduce instances where Newburgh had acted disrespectfully toward his superiors, defied military hierarchy, and borne false witness at previous trials. The heart of the Army's case against Robert Newburgh centered around his relationship with a private soldier. On the third day of the trial, Captain Chapman called Private Nicholas Gaffney and proceeded to elicit from him a tale of how Robert Newburgh had seduced him. In so doing, Chapman used Robert Newburgh's reputation as a buggerer to argue that he had manipulated an innocent soldier in order to bring disorder to the regiment. Nicholas Gaffney was a longtime member of the Royal Irish, and he had grown disgruntled in the service. The year before, he had accused his own captain of corruption and demanded that he be tried. However, Gaffney was unable to substantiate the charges, and he was subsequently found himself court-martialed. The idea of an enlisted man questioning the character of an officer offended many in the 18th Regiment. It indicated that military hierarchy was being challenged from below. As colonists in Philadelphia and New York became increasingly vocal in their questioning of monarchy and imperial rule, such instability within the British Army was deemed particularly troubling. Throughout the summer of 1774, Private Gaffney had received legal advice from Robert Newburgh. This was initially kept secret from the officers of the regiment. But when Newburgh's involvement was discovered, the officers concluded that Gaffney would not have carried matters to those violent lengths had he not been assisted privately by some miscreant. For many in the Royal Irish Regiment, Robert Newburgh's assistance of Nicholas Gaffney proved that he did not care about the social order and was further proof of his character as a buggerer. At Newburgh's court-martial, Private Gaffney was the Army's star witness. Captain Chapman called him and elicited a testimony that described the two men's relationship as entirely inappropriate. According to Gaffney, Newburgh arranged meetings in his private chambers. Did Mr. Newburgh and he ever drink together? Chapman asked. Yes, frequently, Gaffney replied. The private also testified that the priest had given him a snuff box, a feminine article that many associated with macaronis, and that Newburgh had told lewd stories in his presence. Gaffney also claimed that at times Newburgh and he had been alone together after dark. He has gone there at 10 o'clock at night when Mr. Newburgh has been in bed, Gaffney told the court. Newburgh, upon seeing him, put on his morning gown, and he went into the closet to him. Not only had the two men been in a bedroom at night, Newburgh had been in a state of undress. Through his questions, Captain Chapman followed the tropes of particular novels of the era in order to argue that the priest had seduced the private. Newburgh invited Gaffney into his private chambers, plied him with alcohol and gifts and flattery. Gaffney was innocent, simple, and trusting, while Newburgh was elite, educated, and manipulative. Everyone knew that Newburgh had slept with his servant, and Chapman used this to suggest that he had similar designs on Gaffney. Now, to be sure, Captain Chapman never intimated that Newburgh and Gaffney had had sex. But a buggerer's disregard for the natural order was not confined to the physical. Instead of seducing Gaffney into bed, Newburgh persuaded him to bring charges against his superiors in order to undermine military hierarchy. Newburgh hated the 18th Regiment, Chapman argued, and Gaffney was a pawn of his designs. Once Captain Chapman concluded his case, it was up to Robert Newburgh to offer a defense. Newburgh questioned the facts of the Army's case and called his two friends, Lieutenant Fowler and Ensign Trist, to speak to the strength of his character. Newburgh asked Fowler whether during their acquaintance he has ever observed him guilty of any immoral or indecent behavior, unbecoming a clergyman and a gentleman, to which Fowler replied, he never did. He always found Mr. Newburgh's company polite, agreeable, and edifying. Trist offered a similarly glowing appraisal of Newburgh's character. In effect, both Fowler and Trist argued that because Newburgh had had such a stellar character, he could not be a buggerer. The sanguine opinions of Fowler and Trist toward Newburgh stemmed from their own characters. Both men stood apart from the other officers in the regiment. Fowler was disabled, and Trist was older. They also both disliked Captain Chapman and believed his persecution of Newburgh was an instance of petty tyranny. Fowler and Trist also differed from the other officers in that they were married. However, Nicholas Trist's marriage raised questions about his loyalty. When Trist wed the daughter of a Philadelphia innkeeper, Major Hamilton speculated that he intends becoming a patriotic American, as the anti-British sentiments of Trist's new in-laws were well known throughout the colonies. To be sure, neither Fowler nor Trist were tolerant of buggerers. Like other officers, they had heard stories of Newburgh's sleeping arrangements, and both men treated him with skepticism when they first met him. But as they got to know Newburgh, the two became impressed by his character. Whatever may or may not have happened back in Ireland was of no concern to them, because Newburgh had proven himself to be an upstanding priest and a good friend. Accordingly, they ignored the rumors of buggery. Whether or not they were true was of no concern to them. Robert Newburgh also presented an impressive closing argument in his case. Having conceded that everyone thought he was a buggerer, he pivoted toward an argument about rights and how personal preferences did not matter. He invoked the ideology and rhetoric of the Enlightenment to argue that how a man dressed and what he did in private should have no impact on his ability to do his job. In so doing, he came dangerously close to mouthing the same words as the men who would declare independence 2 years later. Newburgh began his closing arguments by dismissing charges of perjury and falsehood as mere misunderstandings. He then refuted Private Gaffney's claim that he had seduced him into making unfounded charges against his captain. Newburgh insisted that his assistance of Gaffney was motivated by Christian charity and not sexual desire. I had always been taught by men, by nature, were entitled to equal rights, and that it was my duty as a gentleman and a Christian to afford relief to distress, whether I found it in a lord or a beggar, an officer or a soldier, Robert Newburgh told the court. I was, I confess, deceived and disappointed, he explained, but as chaplain to the regiment, it was his duty to help the less fortunate. Newburgh had to address other claims about his appearance. While Captain Chapman asserted that Robert Newburgh had the appearance of a macaroni, Newburgh asked why this mattered. What a clergyman wore had been the subject of bitter debate in medieval times, but from the little acquaintance I had gained with the world of this age, I imagined all those old prejudices were exploded, and that men and ministers were judged of more by their principles and doctrines than their dress. So long as a man did his job, it did not matter what he looked like. Throughout his defense and his closing arguments, Robert Newburgh never argued that a man had a right to be a buggerer or that what a person did in private was irrelevant. Nevertheless, his rhetoric anticipated the sexual liberalism of a later age. His mention of equal rights in reference to Gaffney suggests that he believed there was a place for all men in society, not just the high and mighty. Likewise, his dismissal of old prejudices indicates that he believed himself to be in a more enlightened age, where a man's appearance was irrelevant. Robert Newburgh made all of these claims while standing accused of being a buggerer. Perhaps he understood the connection. Certainly his enemies did. Now, I won't tell you how the court-martial turned out, because I want you to buy the book. But rest assured, there's a lot more homosexuality, revolution, and trials than I can cover here today. But I don't want to end my talk without drawing some larger conclusions from the case. I think that the trials of Robert Newburgh offer answers to the questions of how people thought about homosexuality in revolutionary America and what they thought about it. On the one hand, the trials confirm our worst suspicions of the past as overflowing with hatred and homophobia. Thomas Batt thought that the rumor of buggery was sufficient for Newburgh to lose his position, while Captain Chapman cited appearance as proof of sexual desire. And this revulsion was felt widely. The most charitable responses came from Lieutenant Fowler and Ensign Trist, who just wanted to ignore the whole thing and all the unpleasant things being said about their friend. On the other hand, there are parts of the trials that subvert such a pessimistic view of the past. Newburgh's response to the accusations against him is one of the most surprising. He faced his accusers openly, even though such actions only confirmed suspicions about his character. He also spoke about rights and equality at a time when such talk was deeply suspect in the British Army. The loyalty of Fowler and Trist is also remarkable. They knew the rumors about his sexual activities, but defended their friend anyway. I think that this dichotomy is reflective of homosexuality in the era of the American Revolution. Male-male intimacy was a controversial topic, and different people had different opinions about it. Some thought that buggerers should be put to death, and others laughed at them. Some ignored them, and others wondered if society might be more tolerant. The difference of opinion is not wholly foreign from our own time, such that I think the 18th century views of buggery were more similar to 21st views than we may think. The trials of Robert Newburgh also offer a new way for us to think about the American Revolution. I find it interesting that the officers' opinions of Newburgh correlated to the impending division between Britain and its colonies. A month after Newburgh's court-martial, several members of the 18th Regiment were deployed to Massachusetts, and many took part in the battles of Lexington and Concord. As the war proceeded, the men who had been the most determined to evict Newburgh from the British Army led the charge to prevent American independence. Both Thomas Batt and Benjamin Chapman remained loyal to King George III as they sought to defend the British Empire from disintegration. By contrast, Newburgh's staunchest defenders left the British Army and became citizens of the United States. Alexander Fowler worked for the Continental Congress during the war and later became a merchant in Pittsburgh. Nicholas Trist moved to Louisiana and began a plantation near Manchac. Both men were patriots. Fowler ran for Congress as a member of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, while Trist's wife, Elizabeth, was buried in an unmarked grave at Monticello when she died. This divergence of loyalty matched opinions of homosexuality. The opinions of Batt and Chapman reflected a British approach, one steeped in scandal that connected a man's personal character to the fate of the empire. In such a worldview, a buggerer was a cause for disorder, and he had to be rooted out lest he pull down the natural order. By contrast, Fowler and Trist exhibited a more laissez-faire attitude. They could ignore men who had sex with men. A buggerer was less of a threat to the social order than an exacting captain or a British king. This correlation is the true legacy of Robert Newburgh's trials for us today. The men who found themselves at odds with the British Army, with its persecution of Robert Newburgh, helped to found a new nation. For them, buggery was something that did not disqualify a man from his position, and by extension did not prohibit one from citizenship. Historians have argued that because of the ideology of the American Revolution contained a commitment to individual rights and liberties, that the nation that followed always contained the seeds of abolitionism, feminism, and social equality. For this reason, we should not be so quick to dismiss the revolutionary potential of Robert Newburgh's trials. Perhaps as with race and gender, we can appreciate the potential for inclusion for LGBTQ+ people that was inherent in the creation of the United States, even if full equality was denied for another 2 centuries. Thank you.